Bienvenue, hello and welcome. This is City Breaks Marseille, episode 4, and I'm Marion Jones. We have been round the harbour and the central part of Marseille. We've been up to Notre-Dame de la Garde, so it's really time to look at the hill on the other side of the harbour, Le Panier, which has very much got its own atmosphere, unlike any other part of Marseille, popular with visitors and tourists, and definitely somewhere you're going to want to go, I think. You'll have heard me mention the novelist Jean Claude Izzo before. He wrote the Marseille Noir trilogy that I've quoted from, and he also wrote a collection of essays called Garlic, Mint and Sweet Basil, a love song really to his home city, Marseille. And this is what he wrote about Le Panier. To linger in Le Panier is to feel the old heart of Marseille throbbing. And the next sentence was interesting too, because he wrote, "It's a heart that speaks the languages of the world, the languages of exile." And those are the two key points about Le Panier. It's the very essence of Marseille, and it's the part which has attracted immigrants from all over the world. The little area where people from so many different countries and cultures have gathered, made their home, and made their mark. So, first things first, how are you going to get there? I think I mentioned in the last episode that the petit train, the little tourist train that leaves from the harbour, has two routes, one of which is up into Le Panier, so that's an option. You can get on, you can get off at the top and have time to look round and then get a different petit train down again. I would say, though, that maybe on this side, perhaps walking up is more of an option. Notre-Dame de la Garde is quite a long trek. Le Panier isn't quite as high, and what you'll see on the way up, the winding roads, the sets of steps, etc., is very much part and parcel of the area. So if you can walk, that might be a thing to consider. Just keep going up and round, and that'll probably sort it. Or if you've got a map with you, you could head for the Place des Moulins, the shady little square towards the top, which is really the heart of Le Panier. Perhaps go up one way, come down another. It's very much about what you'll see en route, as well as what you'll see when you get there. So, general atmosphere. I've seen it described as being really a village within a city, a little area that's a bit cut off because of its height, the fact that you have to climb a hill to get up there, and so very much has developed its own character. Definitely a Mediterranean feel up there. Narrow streets, little sets of steps, hills everywhere, whitewashed houses. Well, they were whitewashed originally. A lot of them are washed in bright colours now, yellows, oranges, the sunny colours, if you will. It's a place where you're quite likely to see washing lines stretched across the street. You're definitely going to see plenty of street art. You'll catch some sea views. You'll keep coming across artisans' workshops and little craft shops. And the flowers are a feature too, whether that be a tub here or some baskets there, a few pots along a windowsill. Historically, it's been a poor area for centuries. It's been overcrowded. It's had a not great reputation, followed by quite the makeover in the last 50 years or so. But the overriding thing you notice, I think, is the colour. House fronts, street art, flowers, it all combines to make a really cheerful atmosphere. I've seen it described as being the little Montmartre, or the Montmartre of Marseille, which I sort of understand, because yes, it's up a hill, yes, it's a place apart, it's got quite an artistic flavour to it, but Parisian it definitely is not. It's much more a Mediterranean feel. Another novelist who also came from the area, Jean Claude, described the Rue du Panier, which is one of the main roads winding up through it, as follows. Its crowd of sailors, its women, its brightly clad children, its shimmering paving stones, zinc roofs, the road winds its way between the houses and up the hill like a snake on the move. I might mention too that it's an area that's very well known to most French people because it was the setting in a popular soap opera called Plus Belle la Vie, which ran for, I think, about 15 years and finished in 2020. It told you all about the daily lives of the inhabitants. It had a fictional name. They didn't call it Le Panier. They called it Le Mistral, after the famous wind that blows through Provence. But people got caught up in the story of the love lives and the friendships and the criminal intrigues which took place there. So that's another reason why it's a much visited area of the city. Okay, let's just step back in time a little bit, a very quick sweep of the history of the place. So it is the oldest part of Marseille, the bit where the Greeks settled when they were first allowed to stay here. They were given 60 hectares of land, including the area that's now Le Panier, and so that's why it's definitely right to call it the heart of the city, because in the very earliest of days it was the city. In the Middle Ages, as the settlement grew, it started to become a place apart, for the reason that it was where quite a few religious communities stayed. So it was a place of silent streets and monasteries, and you can see this part of its history in some of the road names you'll come across. For example, Rue de l'Observance, the observance being a reference to religious observance. La Rue du Bon Jésus, Good Jesus' Road. La Rue de la Charité, literally Charity Street. By the 17th century, the better-off people in Marseille were beginning to leave this area. They fancied the new open spaces down where the Canebière is now, for example, and so what was left was really the poorer sections of society. And at that point it started to become more and more overcrowded, poorly maintained, and gradually an area that closed in on itself a bit, was somewhere that not everybody wanted to go any longer. The word which sums up its 19th century history is immigration, because waves and waves of people started to arrive, firstly from Italy, mainly from the city of Naples, but also from Corsica. One Napoleon Bonaparte lived here while he was training in the coastal artillery. He and his mother and sisters rented a house in La Rue de la Caissière, and gradually, in fact, the area became very closely associated with the sea, so the people who lived here were often fishermen or boatmen. And then, particularly in the 20th century, came waves of people from other further off places, particularly from Algeria, from other North African countries. And in Jean Claude Izzo's novel, Total Chaos, which is the first of his Marseille Noir trilogy, there's actually quite a lot on this theme. Here, for example, early in the novel, he's describing a main character being in Le Panier and thinking of it as his neighbourhood. He'd been born there to parents who had arrived as immigrants. This is what he writes about that. His father had lived on Rue de la Charité when he first arrived in France, fleeing poverty and Mussolini. He was 20 and had 2 of his brothers in tow, Nabos, Neapolitans. 3 others had gone to Argentina. They did the jobs the French wouldn't touch. His father was hired as a longshoreman, paid by the centime. Harbour dogs, they were called. It was meant as an insult. His mother worked packing dates 14 hours a day. In the evenings, the Nabos and the people from the north, the Babis, met up on the streets. They pulled chairs out in front of their doors, talked through the windows, just like in Italy, just like in the good old days. So very much that sense of hard-working people having to start again and live quite impoverished, difficult lives, and also the sense of community that they brought with them. World War II, of course, had a major impact in Marseille, discussed in previous episodes, so I'll just refer to it quickly here. But Le Panier was very much affected, and you'll find, if you look on a map, a square named in memory of what happened. It's called the 23rd of January 1943 square, named after the day when the Germans and the Vichy government, on their behalf, saw to it that Le Panier was both evacuated and practically destroyed. So a day or two before that, there had been roundups all over the city. 40,000 people had had their papers checked, and 2,000 Jews had been arrested and sent via Drancy in Paris to the death camps. And then, very early on the morning of the 23rd of January, 6 a.m., the population of Le Panier heard loudspeakers, people telling them they had to leave now. They had to grab whatever belongings they could carry and get out. Most grabbed what they could and left. Some took wheelbarrows, laden with their possessions, and rushed off up La Canebière, presumably to the station in the hope of getting out of the city. There was a house-by-house search through Le Panier, and then the dynamiting started. Nearly 1,500 buildings were destroyed. The reason given by the Vichy government, so that's the French government, ruling on behalf of, in conjunction with, the Germans, was expressed as follows. Marseille is a hideout for international bandits. This city is the canker of Europe, and Europe cannot live as long as Europe remains unpurged. In fact, at least part of the reason would have been that there was a resistance operating from Marseille, but that applied in many parts of France, and nowhere else, as far as I'm aware, did they talk in such derogatory terms about an area that needed to be, in quotes, cleansed. And when they talked about Marseille, I think they did mean the city in general, but it was here in Le Panier that they most concentrated their efforts. Stories of some of the residents are told in the Musée de la Déportation, the Deportation Museum, just below the Saint-Jean Fort, and here, as an illustration, just one person's story. Ida Palombo, she was called, born in 1924 to a Jewish family who lived in the Panier district. Her father was one of those rounded up and deported in 1943, but she and the rest of her family somehow managed to survive and went into hiding. But a year later, in May 1944, they were denounced, so neighbours somewhere in the district presumably had betrayed them to the milice, that's the French police, working for the Vichy regime, and the whole family was sent to Auschwitz. Ida survived, and when she eventually got back to Marseille, she married David Palombo, who was the only surviving member of his family. So a terrible illustration of the fate that befell so many families here, that they were torn apart, separated, in some cases wiped out. Ida Palombo remained in Marseille. She worked on the Wall of Names, which you can visit today in the Deportation Museum, collecting together painstakingly the names of everyone who was deported from Marseille. She gave talks in schools. She took a group with her to Auschwitz every year. So there's an idea of the general sweep of history in Le Panier. It's pretty much always been a place apart. By the 19th and 20th century, it was somewhere with a bad reputation, crime, danger, avoided even by some of the Marseille citizens, but really quite a makeover in the latter half of the 20th century, so that now it's a popular area for tourists to visit, a sort of Mediterranean Montmartre, if you will. Although I might add that not everyone living there was happy with the changes. They didn't like the gentrification. They felt that bringing Le Petit Train up into an area where there are no cars made them feel a little bit as if they were exhibits in the zoo. They queried what happens when you open tourist shops selling crafts and whatnot to the local shops selling the stuff that the people who actually live there need. But I have to say that when I went, it did feel like a thriving little area that was very pleasant to walk round. Talking of which, let's go through some of the things you might see if you go and visit. I'd suggest using a self-guided walk idea, which was published, I think, by the Tourist Office, and for which I'll put links in the show notes and on the blog post. That's one way to find your way around, and there are explanations as you go of what some of the buildings that you're passing are. Or, of course, you might prefer to just set out, go a-wandering, and see what you come across. So, things you might come across include a historical monument called La Maison Diamantée, the Diamond House, which was a 16th century palace with a diamante patterned facade. There are one or two little churches to pass, the Acoul, for example, and the Saint-Laurent. There are statues and plaques here and there to tell you a little bit more about people from the area who became well known, starting way back with a Greek explorer with a pretty much unpronounceable name. I'm going to say Euthymenes, maybe, who sailed from Marseille and explored the West African coast. There are plaques to artists and writers, and I noticed they tended to be people with a social conscience, people who'd come up through this rather difficult area and wanted to write about it or depict it in their paintings. They weren't people that I'd heard of before, but just to give a couple of examples, a 19th century artist called Honoré Daumier, and a poet, Victor Gelu, actually born in Marseille, whose life, I read somewhere, was un long tourment, one long torment, seemingly for political reasons. He grew up in a very poor family in Le Panier, turned into a staunch Republican, we're talking in the 1850s, 60s, 70s, and who wrote poems and songs describing the difficulties of life for poor people in an area like this. And there was also someone else I didn't know, Jean-Louis Laniel, but the plaque to him describes him as the creator of the Cent Ans Marseillais, so those little figures that you get originally for nativity scenes at Christmas, but now which are sold in shops all over the area, bought by tourists but very much collected by local families too. And it all started here in Le Panier, around about the turn of the 19th century. He died in 1822. A definite highlight is the little squares that you'll pass through, quite often tree-shaded, little cafes, perhaps a fountain or two. Nice to walk through, nice to linger in. So, for example, there's the Place de l'Anche, which was apparently the site of the original Greek agora, so the marketplace, and from where you get stunning views of Notre-Dame de la Garde on the other side of the harbour. There's the Place des Pistoles, just near the Vieille Charité, where you're probably going to want to stop. That's a larger square, lots of little restaurants with tree-shaded terraces. And at the top, the Place des Moulins. Moulin means windmill, and there were 40 or so windmills up there at one point, only one of which is left today, and a description I found of the Place des Moulins said it was the most hidden of the squares in Le Panier and had, quote, all the charm of a Provençal village with its plane trees and fountains. You'll get some stunning views, not just of Notre-Dame de la Garde, but of the coast and the harbour and the forts. And there are two more major sites that you might want to actually go into, and they are the Vieille Charité and the Major. So the Vieille Charité was the former poorhouse, built in the 17th century after a law said that every city should have a hospice or lodgings to offer to people who are too ill or too elderly to look after themselves. And this one is a stunning building. Definitely have a look at it, even if you don't go right in. And it's significant because it was built, the architect was Pierre Puget, whom I mentioned in a previous episode, and who was known as the French Michelangelo for his wonderful sculptures, and he was born in Le Panier, so this will have been a project very close to his heart. He began working on it in 1670, but it wasn't finished until about 1745, so there must have been other people who took on the baton after him. But you would not guess that from the style, because it's one of those beautiful, amazingly uniform projects, which looks as if one very inspired person must have designed it. So it was a home for the poor. Gradually during the 19th century it became a prison, somewhere to forcibly put the homeless or beggars, and then gradually it fell into disuse, and it wasn't until the 1960s that someone decided they really should be making more of this wonderful building, and a major renovation project started. These days it houses various museums and art galleries, and is used for all kinds of other purposes, meetings and conferences and whatnot. And I found a couple of really good descriptions of it in a novel by Peter Mayle, which is called The Marseille Caper, when some of the main characters visit La Charité for some sort of conference. Okay, so here's a description of the outside of the building. It was an immense quadrangle, built around a courtyard, perhaps 100 yards long and 50 yards wide. Surrounding the courtyard was a series of 3-storey buildings, their facades pierced by an elegant succession of arches leading to an interior gallery, and in the middle of the courtyard stood a charming, domed chapel. And then just a page or two later, one of the characters goes into the reception in the chapel. So here's a second quote. Elena looked around at the chapel, the alcoves around the side, each with its graceful arch and marble statue, the lovely proportions of the room, the domed ceiling, the soft evening light filtering through the high windows, and she let out a sigh. This is magic. Why don't we do buildings like this anymore? So yes, definitely one of the highlights of Marseille, and who knew, hidden up here in Le Panier. And the other highlight of the area is the city's second cathedral, known as the Cathédrale Major. Actually, its full title is longer than that, La Cathédrale Sainte-Marie Majeure, but the locals have shortened it to just La Major. Major, I think, being the Provençal word for big. And it's yet another of those sites where there's been worship since almost forever. I think the earliest church was built there in the 4th century. It was destroyed and rebuilt and extended a number of times, but there is a little piece left. You have to go round to the back of the main new building to see it, and the remains that are there date from the 12th century. But the big new, in inverted commas, cathedral came into being in the 19th century. That period, 1850s onwards, when Marseille was becoming quite wealthy because of all the trade and commerce. The same period when Notre Dame de la Garde was built and the Chamber of Commerce. And it was decided that here, where they were extending the port and where ships were going to be arriving from all over the world, would be a good place to build a new cathedral, a second one, as a sort of spiritual lighthouse. It would be the first thing that people arriving by sea in the city would see. So important was it deemed that Napoleon III himself came to lay the first stone. That was in 1852. The first service wasn't held until 40 years later, so a major project. And it is huge. One of the largest cathedrals in France, nearly as big as St. Peter's in Rome, apparently, and with seating for 3,000 worshippers inside. There were lots of arguments about the design. Should it be Gothic or Romanesque, or what about Byzantine? So the result is really a mix. The main body of the church is like a large Romanesque building, but it's got cupolas as well, very much in the Eastern or Byzantine tradition. And the architect himself apparently said he wanted it to be a symbol of Marseille as what he called a porte vers l'Orient, so a gateway to the East. So yet another example of the mixing of cultures in Marseille. It's a beauty. 400 columns of marble and porphyry. Fantastic materials were fetched from lots of different places. White Carrara marble from Tuscany, along with a beautiful green marble that you'll recognise if you've seen any of the big Florence churches. There's onyx from Tunisia. There are mosaics from Venice. Really no expense was spared. Lots of sculptures inside too, of course, of Christ, of the Apostles, St. Peter, St. Paul, and a lesser-known one, but a significant one, of someone called Monseigneur de Belzunce, who was Bishop of Marseille in 1720, which of course was the year when the city was ravaged by the plague, so he was the poor man in charge of everybody's spiritual well-being during that terrible time. There is one very significant day every year as far as La Major and indeed Le Panier are concerned, and that is August the 15th, when the Procession à la Madone takes place, so the procession to the Madonna, and the golden statue of Mary is taken out of the church and processed through Le Panier. Large crowds of people gather to see her, people hang rosaries over her arms, people leave votifs, so little messages and prayers on her. They bring their children, apparently, and present them to her. So those are the two main sites, really. I think if you wander up from the harbour, past or preferably into La Vieille Charité, and then down the other side to La Major, on a route that's taken you through some little squares and past some shops and whatnot, then you've definitely got a flavour of Le Panier. As for all the other establishments there then, small bistros, lots of shops selling Marseille products, so food items, pastis. You can buy bottles of pastis to take home, and there are plenty of little bars and restaurants who will serve you the aniseed-flavoured liqueur. Another item you'll see quite a lot of is soap. So Marseille in the 19th century was famous for its soap industry, and that's been carried on today. There's a very fascinating little shop-stroke-museum called La Maison de la Boule, so the House of the Bowls, where you can see photographs and trophies relating to that game of boule that you see played in so many little squares all over southern France, and where also you can buy your own set to take home. When I was in there, I heard the shop assistant dispensing advice to some French customers about what the difference was between all the different weights that were available. I'll be talking a little bit more about that in the episode on shopping, which is still to come. But as a general summary, you can expect craft shops aplenty, one or two antique dealers, lots of little workshops with their own shop front where people are making all kinds of things. Clothes, for example, sometimes but not always, using very ethnic-looking fabrics. I went into one where the lady had her sewing machine out and was doing an on-the-spot alteration for a customer. There are others selling paintings, textiles and furniture, lovely cushions and duvet covers and whatnot. Quite an emphasis on ceramics as well, so tiles and pots and mosaics. I saw some jewellery shops. I didn't see, but I wouldn't be surprised to find a pop-up art gallery or two. And actually, even if you don't come across such a thing, you will not lack for art to look at in Le Panier, because it is full of street art. An outdoor urban art gallery, if you will. On the house fronts, sometimes on practically every house in a particular little street, alongside the sets of steps, on the walls surrounding some of the squares, just everywhere. I found a blog post called Street Art and Charm in Le Panier, written by Phoebe Thomas, and here's what she had to say on the subject. One of the most striking things about Le Panier is all the street art found in every alley, nook and cranny. This is not the legally sanctioned elegant murals that you find in Cannes, but raw, gritty and often grungy street art with plenty of graffiti too. When I did a little research, I discovered that one Nobi, Nhobi, is a Brazilian artist, quite a well-known one, who moved to Marseille in 2012 and remained there, and that lots of his art can be found around and about. But really, I think it's more about just wandering and looking, seeing what catches your eye, and probably taking lots of photos. It's quite hard to describe artwork on a podcast, so I think I'd prefer to just put a number of photos on the blog for you to go and have a look at. I can't promise you that what I saw recently will be there when you go, because I got the feeling that these things were quite ephemeral, being covered up and renewed and resprayed really quite frequently. What I think I can say for certain is that there will certainly be plenty of street art to look at. And it's just one of the many things that make Le Panier such a colourful area to visit. When you're back home, I think you will remember the Charité and the Major. You'll remember the general atmosphere of little squares and narrow streets and steps, but I think you'll certainly also remember the colours, the house fronts, so many bright shades of orange and yellow, a sprinkling of pink and purple as well, all the street art tending to be in bolder colours and quite a lot of graffiti in black, and quite an abundance of plants and flowers. So all adding up to quite the feast for the eyes. Okay, so that rounds off what I wanted to say about Le Panier. Just a brief mention of the next episode, which is going to focus on the new harbour area, La Joliette as it's called, with a particular focus on the two big new museums that were built there to mark the fact that Marseille was a city of European culture in 2013. So that's the MUCEM, MUCEM, which stands for Museum of Civilizations of Europe and the Mediterranean. So very much focusing on the fact that Marseille is, yes, a French city with all that that means for its history and its culture, but it's also very much a Mediterranean city, a city which in fact could become a focal point of the area. There's a permanent exhibition about Mediterranean culture there, and a whole host of temporary exhibitions come and go, featuring a whole multitude of aspects. And practically next door is the Jacques Cosquet Museum, also connected to the Mediterranean, but in a very different way. Because Jacques Cosquet was an undersea diver who discovered along the coastline just up from Marseille a whole network of caves, some of which had cave art in them dating from over 30,000 years ago. They were deemed too fragile to be opened up to the public, so what they did instead was they've opened this recreation in the form of a museum where they've rebuilt some of the main caves, put copies of the artwork, and which you can explore in a little boat. It takes you round, tells you the history, and shows you the artwork. Totally fascinating. We'll have a quick look too at one or two other aspects of La Joliette, where there's a whole leisure area has opened up with some interesting shops and one or two other little surprises. So all of that to come in the next episode. For today, though, I hope you've enjoyed our trip to Le Panier, and I'd like to sign off, as usual, in French. Merci bien pour l'écoute et au revoir. Thank you very much for listening, and goodbye.